Just when you think you've got a handle on the political map, it gets completely redrawn.
Yeah.
The electoral boundaries for GE 2025 have seen this, well, massive overhaul. Only 9 out of 31 constituencies still have their 2020 borders.
9 out of 31.
Right.
That's quite something.
It really is. So for you, the learner, the big questions are, what does this huge reshaping actually mean for Singapore's political scene? And what are the key things you really need to keep an eye on?
Well, this isn't just going to be a simple recap of election night.
Oh,
Our deep dive today, we're aiming to really dissect the shifts, the potential future directions,
yeah.
drawing on expert analysis of these new maps, post-election commentary, and even some of the chatter happening online.
Exactly. Think of this as your sort of streamlined guide. We want to understand the forces at play. We'll look at the PAP, their challenges, their focus,
Right.
the Workers' Party trying to, well, consolidate,
Mm-hmm.
the PSP needing to adapt, definitely. And these broader trends, like how citizens, especially younger ones, are getting involved.
And the goal is really to give you a clear picture of what matters, without getting bogged down in every single detail.
Absolutely. So let's kick off with these boundary changes, their impact.
Okay, so the first thing that's just striking is the sheer scale of the changes. The Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy Research really highlights this. The Electoral Boundaries Review Committee made some substantial changes.
Substantial is putting it mildly.
Yeah, for a lot of voters, their constituency, and therefore, who they might vote for, it's going to look quite different this time compared to 2020.
And maybe we should quickly clarify GRCs.
Oh, good point. Yeah.
Yeah.
GRC, Group Representation Constituency, means a team of candidates from one party running together.
Right. So if you were in, say, Jurong GRC before, now you might be in a totally new one, like West Coast Jurong West.
Or Jurong East Bukit Batok.
Or maybe even a single-member constituency, an SMC, like Jurong Central. Or maybe you got absorbed into Holland Bukit Timah GRC.
Exactly. It's like your neighborhood got reshuffled, basically. You could be seeing totally new potential reps from the PAP and the opposition.
And a lot of MPs who've been around for a while, their traditional patches have been, merged or split up.
That's right. They might find themselves having to work together in completely new GRC teams.
Which means voters could see a whole different slate of PIP candidates than they're used to.
And for the opposition, well, the potential matchups have become quite varied now.
Which could lead to some really interesting contests, couldn't it? If we look back at 2020 as a rough guide, the new West Coast Jurong West GRC, you could potentially see PIP, PSP, maybe even Red Dot United.
Possibly. And Jurong East Bukit Batok, PSP, SDP, RDU could all be in the mix there.
Then over in the east, the redrawn Marine Parade Brattle Heights.
Yeah.
You could have the Workers' Party, SPP, PPP, People's Voice. Quite a crowd, potentially.
And this brings up a really important point about the voter experience.
Yeah.
Many people do feel a connection to their local MP, right? Especially if they've been active sorting out local issues.
Sure, that personal touch.
Exactly. So when the boundaries shift and that familiar face isn't representing your specific block anymore, it could, well, weaken that tie.
And if that personal connection weakens, maybe voters become a bit more open to looking at the opposition.
Could be. Or perhaps they shift their focus more towards the big national picture rather than just the local personalities.
Though, of course, regardless of who's where on the map, some issues are always going to be front and center for voters.
Oh, absolutely. The economy, jobs, housing affordability, availability, and just navigating, the tricky international situation. These big national concerns, they could cut across all constituencies, really.
Doesn't matter if your boundary moved an inch or a mile.
Pretty much. So yeah, the local candidate matters, their engagement, but the government's overall record, the opposition's alternatives, those remain huge factors.
Okay, so let's zoom in on the PIP then.
Right. So the PAP, they won decisively. 65.57% of the vote, 87 seats. That's a strong majority.
It is, but we should remember GE 2020 saw their popular vote drop a bit, and there's definitely ongoing public discussion about, cost of living, inequality.
And maybe a desire for more political openness, too.
Yeah. And GE 2025, this is PM Lawrence Wong's first big electoral test as the leader.
That's a key point. He's even talked publicly about concerns over a potentially weakened mandate, especially with global trade being so uncertain.
He warned, didn't he, that a less strong PAP might embolden external pressures.
He did. And we saw the government roll out things like cash handouts, vouchers.
Clearly aimed at easing that economic pressure.
Absolutely. And connecting this to, say, online chatter, The whole theme of accountability came up. Like on Reddit, people were discussing figures like Mr. Eng Chi Meng.
Ah, right, given the very close results in his GRC.
Yeah, questions were raised online about, his potential future role if he remained in NCM given that tight race.
So it really highlights the balancing act for PM Wong, doesn't it?
It really does. He needs to keep that strong majority, obviously, but also uh, work to rebuild trust with certain groups, the middle class perhaps, who are feeling the pinch.
They're looking for effectiveness, sure, but also that sense of accountability.
Exactly. Now, shifting gears to the opposition, the Workers' Party really stands out.
They're still the only opposition party actually in Parliament. That's significant, and they held on to their ground.
They did, and what's interesting is even though they didn't win more seats, they showed real strength in some key GRCs they contested.
Like Tampines. That was a four-way fight.
Right, WP got 47.37% there, and in Pungal, 44.83%. Those weren't massive wins for the PAP, margin-wise.
No, quite close. And you saw a lot of buzz online, support for the WP candidates in places like Tampines. People hoping they'd stick around, maybe try again.
But there was also, disappointment expressed online about them losing the Jalan Kayu SMC.
True. So it seems their strategy was more about consolidating, shoring up their base.
It looks that way. Not immediate gains in seats, but solidifying their position as the main opposition voice. And probably preparing for, a longer-term leadership role in that space.
Okay, what about the PSP Progress Singapore Party?
Ah, the PSP. Yeah, their results were widely called very shocking. The party itself said they need to regroup.
And the boundary changes might have played a role there too, especially in West Coast Jurong, West GRC.
It's definitely a factor people are pointing to. That redrawing brought in voters from areas that traditionally lean quite heavily towards the PAP, like Jurong Spring, Tamanjurong.
So that changes the maths considerably.
It does. But beyond the boundaries, there was also this observation, maybe their newer candidates didn't quite connect with voters as strongly this time.
Didn't capture the public imagination during the campaign, the hustings.
Something like that, yeah. Reports suggested they didn't quite cut through as much as maybe some others did.
So where does that leave the PSP? Sounds like a critical moment for them.
It really does. They probably need to think hard about, a rebrand maybe, rethinking their core strategy.
Perhaps broadening beyond just focusing on national policies like minimum wage and GST.
Possibly. And crucially, finding ways to attract younger talent, younger members to stay relevant.
And that drop in their overall vote share, what was it, over 5%, that really underlines the need for some kind of change, adaptation.
Absolutely. It signals a need for serious reflection.
Okay, looking at the opposition more broadly then, it's still a complex picture, isn't it?
Very much so. I mean, Marine Parade Bredell Heights GRC was the only walkover for the PAP.
Which tells you something about the challenge opposition parties face in just fielding candidates everywhere. Unity is still elusive.
Yeah, and we saw those online discussions, too, about so-called mosquito parties, smaller parties struggling to get traction.
And sometimes maybe splitting the opposition vote in certain places.
That's the concern some people raise. Plus, you have different strategies, different ideologies, even within the opposition camp. Debates about endorsing independence, things like that.
So the potential for fragmentation, it's still there.
It seems likely we'll continue to see a degree of fragmentation. Different parties might carve out different niches, perhaps, but that big challenge of presenting a really unified alternative remains.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit. Citizen activism, youth engagement. That seems to be a growing force.
Definitely. The findings from the SG Together initiative were quite telling.
What stood out there?
A clear desire among Singaporeans for deeper participation, more meaningful involvement in governance. They want more open conversations with the government.
Not just voting every few years.
Exactly. There's this call for more trust, more collaboration between the state and citizens, a sense that solving today's big problems needs everyone pulling together.
And transparency keeps coming up too, right?
Yeah.
Access to information.
Hugely important. People want to understand the why behind policies, the trade-offs involved. They want to feel their input is actually heard and considered.
And the way people engage is changing too. Social media, podcasts.
Oh, becoming massive platforms, especially for younger voters. But interestingly, the sources show older groups are getting more involved online too.
So it's not just a youth thing.
Not entirely. These platforms allow for more sort of informal interaction, hearing from politicians, maybe in a less staged way.
And you see it on places like Reddit, young people talking very directly about concerns like housing costs.
And even questioning, does my vote really count? Does it make a difference?
That sustained level of engagement, particularly from younger people, that could really reshape things long term. The whole dynamic between government, opposition, and citizens.
I think so. Synthesizing all these threads, you can sort of see a possible long-term path towards a more maybe balanced political system here.
One where the opposition plays a more substantial role, even if GE 2025 didn't quite deliver that outcome fully.
Potentially. It might nudge things towards more consensus-based governance over time, driven by these citizen demands for transparency, for more diverse voices.
Of course, you've got factors like FICA, the Foreign Interference Act, aiming to keep the discourse, clean.
Right, that's part of the landscape too, ensuring the integrity of the political debate.
Okay, so let's try and boil this down. For you, the learner, what are the absolute key takeaways from this deep dive?
All right, first, those big boundary changes, new candidate lineups, potentially more multi-cornered fights, that's significant.
Got it.
Second, the PAP. Victory, yes, but ongoing pressure on cost of living, needing to rebuild trust, especially with the middle class. Accountability is a theme.
Okay. PAP focus. Stability, trust.
Third, the Workers' Party. They've cemented their place as the main opposition, gearing up for a bigger long-term role.
WP consolidation.
Fourth, the PSP. They're at a crossroads, rebranding, rethinking strategy, attracting new blood that seems crucial for them now.
PSP, regroup and rethink.
Fifth, the broader opposition. Still fragmented, challenges in unity, different paths emerging.
Opposition, fragmented landscape.
And finally, this clear rise in citizen activism and youth engagement. More demands for transparency, for a real say.
Citizen engagement, upward trend, demanding transparency.
That pretty much covers the core points.
Okay, so here's a final thought, something for you to chew on. Given all these moving parts, the government tackling cost of living, the opposition trying to unify and connect, and this rising tide of citizen engagement, what do you think will be the single biggest factor shaping Singapore's political future over, say, the next 5 or 10 years?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is. Definitely something to keep exploring and form your own